Throughout my life, I've felt as though a dark cloud followed me relentlessly. I couldn't pinpoint the cause, but it seemed every hardship imaginable found its way to my doorstep. My beloved wife, once the center of my world, grew distant and eventually left. And just as I began to recover, another blow knocked me down again. Sitting quietly at the bar, I stared into my nearly empty glass, trying to drown out the rising noise of yet another wave of festive patrons. I couldn't stand this time of year. "Sorry, did you say you hate Christmas?" a voice interrupted from beside me. Damn it, did I really voice that aloud? It wasn't my intention, but it was the truth. "Yeah, can't stand all the fake cheerfulness ruining my peace," I muttered, still avoiding eye contact. Now, my friend, it's not about that. Christmas is a time for joy and goodwill," the voice continued, interrupting my thoughts. I turned to see a stout, elderly man with a white beard sitting next to me. He looked like one of those mall Santas taking a break. Where did he come from? I wondered silently. I don't recall noticing his arrival, but then again, with the crush of people in the Rose and Crown bar that night, the Queen herself could walk in and go unnoticed. "Listen, I come to this pub nearly every night seeking a quiet drink to drown my sorrows. Perhaps I'll exchange a few words with George, the bartender, or a couple of my mates. None of us has any particular reason to be jolly. We all wrestle with our own demons, and frankly, we prefer having the bar to ourselves. We don't appreciate all these fools prancing around, wishing everyone a happy bloody Christmas." I scowled in the general direction of the old man. "We all have our troubles in life, my friend, but sometimes you've got to lighten up. This is the season to set aside your worries and find some joy." The old chap smiled back at me. "Why do people assume they can grasp your struggles without knowing anything about you?" I became irritated with the elderly man. "You tell me, what reason do I have to be happy?" I retorted angrily. The audacious old man was really getting on my nerves, so I decided to lay out the whole story for him. Once he heard the details, he would understand why I had no reason to be happy. "Listen, 3 damn years ago, after what I believed was a happy marriage, I returned home from work one afternoon feeling unwell, only to discover my supposedly loving wife in bed with her boss. I lost my mind, and then she ran off with him. He had a lot more money than I did, so when it came to the damn divorce proceedings, she not only got custody of our 3 kids, but also our dog. And you know what the damn woman did next? I'll tell you. She made it incredibly difficult for me to see the kids. For the next 18 months, I was in and out of court, constantly trying to get the bastards to enforce my right to see my children. The damn family courts couldn't care less about fathers. After that, the blasted CSA, the child support agency, those darn jerks, descended upon me like a ton of bricks. They took most of my earnings in child support for the next year or so. They deducted the money straight from my paycheck before I even laid eyes on it, so I couldn't afford to buy the kids much for Christmas that year. I wouldn't have minded so much if my ex and her partner actually needed the money, but the guy she's with owns the company where she works. He rakes in more cash in a week than I do in a year. Do you know what they did that Christmas? Well, let me tell you. They opened my presents to the children before Christmas. Then they went and bought more expensive versions of what I had prepared for the children and gave them to them first. I wasn't even allowed near the children at Christmas. The next time I saw them, my gifts were forgotten while they were playing with the most fashionable toys. Ah, it looks like you have an evil ex-wife, but remember, my friend, when your children grow up, they will understand that you love them, the old man said. Well, that's the one thing they'll never be able to do, sir. Last Christmas, the ex-wife and her partner took the children on vacation. They went skiing in France, but one evening, they all went out together, and the guy got drunk. On the way back to the hotel, he drove his Mercedes into a lake. He made sure that he and his wife got out of the car safely, but everything else was taken out the next morning. I hate him. So now you understand why I'm not happy about Christmas. It doesn't bring me joy, only painful memories, my friend. I sympathize with you in the difficult years you have been through, but it is important to strive to move forward. You need to let go of the past and build a new life for yourself. Remember the positive moments you have experienced with your children. To be honest, we didn't have any good times. As soon as they moved in with this jerk, they got everything they wanted. The kids didn't care about me anymore, they were overly pampered. I saw them about once a month, and they gradually forgot me. Despite my desire to scold him and leave him alone, this elderly man continued to smile at me. There were so many people in the pub that he probably couldn't have moved away even if he wanted to. It's sad to hear what you're going through, he insisted, but you must have had some good times before your wife left. Now it's time to admit that your old life is behind you. Maybe you should think about building a new one for yourself. The old gentleman and I sat in the bar talking until closing time. As the evening wore on, I felt a liking for him. He seemed genuinely concerned for my well-being, urging me to put the past behind me and focus on the future. Shortly before leaving the pub, I noticed him stagger out. After he left, I finished my drink, said goodbye to George, and went home. I don't know if it's lucky or unlucky that I didn't have a car that night. On one hand, I couldn't drive under the influence of alcohol and potentially harm anyone. On the other hand, I couldn't easily fulfill my desire to commit suicide by crashing into a tree. When I came out of the pub, I found an old man leaning against the wall who had clearly drunk more than he could bear. Worried, I realized that I couldn't leave him there as the cold could be fatal. "Come on, where do you live?" "I'll walk you home," I offered. "Thank you, Graham. I feel a little insecure." "I'll be fine as soon as I get some fresh air," he replied. It didn't occur to me at the time, but the old man knew my name, and I'm still puzzling over this detail. Perhaps he accidentally overheard George mention it. We headed to his house, fortunately not too far from my route. The old man leaned on me, continuing to chat about life. To tell the truth, I didn't pay much attention to it, my focus was on getting him home and then back to my bed. Suddenly, the old man straightened up, sobering instantly. "Fire," he exclaimed, somewhat disoriented. I followed his gesture and glanced in the indicated direction. Through the smoke-darkened windows of a nearby house, I could faintly discern a Christmas tree engulfed in flames. Suddenly, with a deafening explosion, the picture window shattered outward. In an instant, the room transformed into a raging inferno, flames consuming the front of the building. "There's a woman and 3 children in that house," the elderly man informed me. In that moment, I became completely alert. Retrieving my mobile phone from my pocket and unlocking it, I handed it to the old man. "Call the fire brigade," I directed him, already sprinting toward the burning house. They say people act bravely because they don't consider the consequences. As I hurled myself at that front door, I was acutely aware that I might not live to see another day, yet deep down, I didn't truly care. As I approached the door, I could sense the intense heat emanating from the flames bursting out of the nearby window. Surprisingly, the door yielded easily to my first attempt. Black smoke billowed around me as I stumbled inside, barely managing to keep my balance. I presumed that anyone still alive in the house at this hour would likely be upstairs in the bedrooms. Most of these semi-detached houses have a similar layout, so finding the staircase was straightforward. Taking the stairs 2 at a time, I hurried up, attempting to shout fire amidst the choking smoke, but my voice failed me. Reaching the top of the stairs, I tried the door of the room directly above where the fire originated. Inside, the smoke was thick, making it difficult to see until I felt the small, motionless bodies of 2 children in their beds. Gathering them in my arms, I emerged from the smoke at the front door where a young man stood. Without hesitation, I handed the 2 girls over to him. After catching my breath and regaining some composure, I re-entered the smoke-filled house. By now, flames were beginning to breach the door of the room where the fire started. As I reached the top of the stairs, there was a sudden whooshing sound as the flames engulfed the door, spreading into the hallway. Peering through the smoke, I glanced back down the stairs, knowing that returning the way I came, it was no longer an option. This time, I headed toward the rear bedroom. Inside, I discovered a woman who seemed to have succumbed to the smoke too. Despite not being particularly strong, I somehow managed to lift her. Glancing out of the back window, I realized escape that way was impossible. Flames were rising from the window below. It seemed to be a connecting lounge downstairs. Funny how random thoughts pop up in moments like these. Returning to the landing, I headed for the other front bedroom. Bursting through the door, I was relieved to spot flashing blue lights outside through the window. Placing the woman on the bed, incidentally on top of her sleeping son, I grabbed a TV set from the wall and hurled it through the window, hoping no one was below. Then, I kicked out the remaining glass as best as I could. I prioritized the boy, lifting him first and leaning out of the broken window to drop him into the waiting arms of a firefighter below. The woman followed suit without objection due to her condition. Glancing around, I saw flames had entered the room. Without hesitation, I propelled myself headfirst after the woman. Fortunately, the fire crew was ready for me. It made me wonder if they were trained for unexpected arrivals like mine. They certainly did a commendable job catching us all. The firefighters placed one of their breathing apparatuses on me to assist in clearing my lungs of smoke. I sat on the pavement, gradually recovering, while they tackled the fire. I observed the ambulance crew attending to the mother and boy. I didn't spot the two girls, but with several ambulances around, they were likely in one farther away. My head pounded, likely from the smoke and the alcohol I had consumed earlier that evening. People approached me, praising me as a hero. I didn't want or need that recognition. Soon after, the police arrived and began pushing everyone back from the fire. I saw my opportunity and quietly slipped away into the gathered crowd. After mingling for a short time, I hastily left. Upon returning home, I took a long shower to rid myself of the smoke smell. I initially thought I'd need to have my clothes cleaned due to the odor, but upon discovering scorch marks, I disposed of them all. It was well past 2 in the morning by the time I finally crawled into bed. The next morning, on Christmas Eve, I dragged myself out of bed around 10, nursing the worst hangover I've ever had. I attributed it to half the beer and half the relentless smoke from last night. As I stood in the kitchen downing coffee and aspirin, my mobile phone began to ring. I located it on the dining room table and answered. "Hello? Is this Graham Stark?" A female voice, unfamiliar to me, inquired. "Yes. What's the matter?" I replied, slipping into my usual grumpy demeanor. I'll admit that was how I typically interacted with people back then. It tended to keep them at arm's length, and that was how I preferred it. "Oh, Mr. Stark, I just wanted to express my gratitude for rescuing my children and me last night." "Who is this?" "I'm Sheila Monroe. You saved my children and me from the fire last night. I just wanted to thank you. We would have perished if it weren't for you." "I'm sorry, but I have no idea what you're talking about, ma'am." I thought denial was the best course to avoid attention. "He said you'd deny it, but I know it was you who saved us from the fire last night. So don't bother denying it, or I'll inform the newspapers about you. And according to what your friend has told me, you wouldn't want that. The press is frantic trying to locate you." "All right, it was me, but there's no need for thanks." "I didn't think, I just acted." "You really don't need to thank me," I assured her. Then curiosity crept in. "By the way, how did you know where to find me?" "Oh, your friend, the kind old gentleman, visited a little while ago. He claimed to be a friend of yours, disclosed your identity, and gave me your number. Would you like to speak with him?" "Yes, I would." There's much to discuss. He left with my mobile phone last. I fell silent. What was I just saying? I was talking to Sheila on my damn phone, but last night, I handed it to the old man to call the fire department after escaping the burning house. I never saw him again. How did I end up with my phone again, and how did he know my name? Oh, it looks like he's gone. I don't see him anywhere. Don't let it bother you. He seems to have a knack for disappearing, I said. Mr. Stark, I know it's a bit much to ask on Christmas Eve, but could you possibly visit the hospital today? My children and I would really like to meet you and express our gratitude in person. We won't reveal your identity if you prefer. Damn it, she asked so nicely. How could I refuse? If you insist, but honestly, knowing you're all safe and sound is thanks enough for me. How hypocritical I was. I truly didn't care about her or her children at all. I couldn't understand why I had rushed into that burning house last night unless it was some unconscious desire to end my own life. Yet, I reluctantly agreed to visit her later. It was around 1:30 when I found her at the hospital. Sheila Monroe was wearing the most peculiar assortment of clothes I'd ever seen. But then again, I hadn't given them time to dress properly the night before, had I? As soon as I entered the room, Sheila recognized me. "Oh, Graham, how kind of you to come," she exclaimed, embracing me as if I were an old family friend. There were 2 other people present who inquired if I was her husband. She clarified, "No, Graham is just a dear friend." After they left us alone, Sheila apologized for her earlier behavior, explaining that the others were reporters and she didn't want them to question my presence. I expressed my gratitude, and then she introduced me to her children. I was surprised that they all seemed to know who I was. Despite the friendly atmosphere, I felt somewhat overwhelmed and uncomfortable. Let's be honest, I hardly knew this family, and their appreciation made me feel uneasy. It also reminded me of what I had lost. Their children were around the same age as mine had been, perhaps a bit younger. I wanted to excuse myself and leave. I shouldn't have gone there in the first place. The elder of the 2 girls, Miranda, who appeared to be around 8 years old, clung to my left arm tightly, while the boy, Jacob, who I estimated to be about a year younger, came over and held on to my right hand steadfastly. The youngest, Iet, seemed to feel excluded but resolved the issue by climbing onto my lap and wrapping her arms around my neck. I was at a loss for words with them. I noticed a sizable bruise on Miranda's face, recalling the impact it made with my shoulder as I lifted her the previous night. However, she never mentioned it. I hadn't been with them for long when a social services worker arrived. She inquired if Sheila had any relatives or friends who could accommodate them, but she didn't. The worker then informed Sheila that she would arrange for her and the children to stay at a local bed and breakfast. Knowing the place she mentioned, I immediately felt sympathy for them. I was familiar with the location. It's a dreadful place filled with asylum seekers and undocumented immigrants awaiting deportation. I'm not sure why I said it, but I suddenly found myself offering Sheila and her children to stay at my place for a while. I had the space, I knew, but the reason behind extending the invitation eluded me. I was taken aback to hear Sheila accept my offer. It's quite bizarre when you think about it. It's not like me at all to offer something like that, and in hindsight, it's odd that Sheila accepted accommodation from someone she barely knew. Things got even stranger when all 4 of us squeezed into my car to head home. Suddenly, I realized I had no food at home, so we made a detour to a supermarket and ended up with 4 carts full of groceries. It was like we were shopping for a family of 5 at Christmas. While waiting at the checkout, I noticed my guests didn't have much in terms of clothing either, so we headed to the clothing store next door, where we made an even bigger dent in my credit card. Although Sheila promised reimbursement, which eventually happened. Upon arriving at my home, I guided them to their designated spaces. Witnessing these children settle into my own children's former rooms was a poignant sight. I offered Sheila my bed and opted to use the fold-out in my downstairs study, ensuring she remained close to the children while I stayed on a different floor. I reasoned that this arrangement would prevent any compromising situation, given the prevalence of peculiar individuals nowadays. I couldn't afford to let my guard down, especially with Sheila being a stranger to me. To the disappointment of the children, my house lacked seasonal decorations. Thus, I retrieved the artificial Christmas tree and decorations from storage, and we embarked on a thorough redecoration spree. Wrestling with the Christmas lights, a task that always seemed to take longer than expected, became part of the routine. Why is it that they always work perfectly when last used, yet upon retrieval, almost every light needed checking? Sheila faced the challenge of finding Christmas presents for the children. I resolved this by unearthing the gifts I had purchased for my own children the previous year, which they never had the chance to receive. Stashing them away had been painful, but ultimately I was relieved to have them for Sheila's children, who were of similar ages. Christmas morning brought a sense of joy that had been absent for years. Watching the children unwrap their presents stirred up complex emotions that I'd rather not dwell on. Sheila took charge of preparing Christmas dinner while I spent time with the children. Around noon, a man from Sheila's insurance company arrived. He was a loss adjuster and had come to assure Sheila that she had nothing to worry about. The company would handle the house repairs and would notify her when and where she could choose her replacement furniture and carpeting. "Wow, they're really efficient," I remarked to Sheila after he left. "No kidding. I hadn't even told them about the fire yet," she replied. "I wonder how they knew where to find me. We never quite figured that out." Later, when we inquired, the insurance company said they had received a phone call on Christmas Eve reporting the fire and making a claim on Sheila's behalf. Oddly, their records showed the call was made in the morning, well before I had gone to the hospital to meet Sheila and before I had invited her and her children to stay with me. That Christmas was a good one for me. Yes, I did kiss Sheila under the mistletoe, but it was a very respectful kiss, and we only did it because the children insisted. Having children in the house again soon caught the neighbors' attention, well, the neighbors' children, actually. On Boxing Day, I looked out of the kitchen window and noticed several of them playing in the garden with Sheila's children. Suddenly, people who had been avoiding eye contact with me for years were smiling and waving enthusiastically whenever they saw me. They also started stopping me in the street for a chat. I thought we were just starting to get used to our new living conditions when the new year came. At exactly midnight, there was a loud knock on the door, and half a dozen neighbors came in waving bottles of alcohol. Before anyone realized what was going on, an impromptu party began. Before my wife left me, it was a regular New Year's Eve event. I think the neighbors stayed away from me for the next couple of years because I became a bit of a bore. Now, it looked like they were making up for lost time. I won't go into details because, to be honest, I don't remember much about that evening, but eventually, I realized that all the neighbors had gone home, and Sheila and I, having drunk much more than we should, were kissing on the couch. Nothing special, but suddenly I noticed that my hands were wandering. I'm not sure where my mind was or what I thought I was doing, but I suddenly realized that it was wrong. Sheila is a very attractive woman, and I think very few men would want to turn her down. But hey, there's nothing special about me, so I couldn't help but wonder why she was letting me do what I was doing. I didn't want her to feel obligated to sleep with me just because she was grateful that I had saved her and the children's lives and given them a place to live. So, I quickly put an end to this encounter. Sheila seemed a bit surprised when I decided to end it. She looked embarrassed and went very quiet for a while before quickly retreating to her room. We never discussed what almost happened that night again, and from that evening on, we never came close to being intimate with each other. However, in the following months, we became very close friends. It was a strange situation, though, with both of us making an effort to avoid any physical contact. We would go out of our way to detour around the room instead of squeezing past each other. The children started calling me Uncle Ray because little Leet had trouble pronouncing Graham. The way she said it sounded like Ray, or something close to it, and soon the other two children picked it up as well. For simplicity and to avoid confusing the children, Sheila also started calling me Ray. Over the next few months, even the neighbors' children began to refer to me as Uncle Ray. Before I knew it, Ray had become my new name. During those months, I spent a lot of time with the children. When you have children in the house, you tend to take them for granted, at least I had with my own children. When they are suddenly not there anymore, you really miss them and regret all the things you should have done with them. Having Sheila's children around felt like a second chance for me, although I did have some melancholy nights wondering if I had been as good a father as I could have been to my own children. Over time I learned that Sheila's husband had taken his own life. His business had gone bankrupt, and he couldn't cope with it. He suffered a nervous breakdown, became deeply depressed, and eventually committed suicide. I didn't find all this out at once, nor entirely from Sheila. Instead, I had to piece it together from various bits of information. Work on Sheila's house began quite quickly, but we were informed early on that it would take a considerable amount of time. The heat had caused extensive damage to the structure, necessitating an almost complete rebuild. Even the people in the other half of the semi-detached house had to move out temporarily while the party wall was rebuilt. All 5 of us visited the house every week to check on the progress. To outsiders, life in my house must have seemed quite normal. Sheila and I, to anyone who didn't know us, must have looked like a married couple living together with our 3 children. But that wasn't the case. There was none of the intimacy that a husband and wife usually share. For the first few months, the only times Sheila and I left the house together were for shopping, visiting the cemetery where her husband was buried alongside my children, and trips to her house to see how the repairs were coming along. Over time, I found myself willingly attending the children's school events. I became genuinely interested in Jacob and Miranda's after-school activities. The teachers' reactions were intriguing. Some of them had taught my own children and were clearly aware of their deaths. One day, a teacher made a significant slip when he mistakenly referred to Miranda by my daughter's name. Miranda corrected him, leaving the teacher quite embarrassed. I mention this because I never made that mistake, though in my dreams the children would sometimes not exactly get mixed up but seem to merge into one another. As my bond with the children grew stronger, my relationship with Sheila remained unchanged. We maintained a certain distance from each other. However, I often found myself watching her out of the corner of my eye. She was an attractive woman, and occasionally I got the sense that she was watching me too. During the summer, I took all of them on a camping trip to Wales. This was a new experience for Sheila and the children. They used the frame tent while I stayed in my old hiking tent. Although it took some time for them to adjust to living without modern conveniences, they eventually enjoyed it, and we had a couple of more weekend trips before the summer ended. Late summer found us, more precisely Sheila, selecting paint colors, furniture, floor coverings, and other items for her house. I drove her around, as I had been doing since she moved in with me, and she often asked for my advice even though I didn't consider myself an expert. By October, the house was nearly finished, and plans were made for them to move back in during the last week of the month. However, this was postponed to early November due to issues with the central heating. Then, quite suddenly, I found myself alone in an empty house again. I had known this day would come, but that first evening coming home to an empty house was truly hard for me. I looked around and walked straight back out. My destination was the Rose and Crown, and as I walked up the street, I wondered if someone had taken my regular bar stool. I hadn't been there since the previous Christmas. Even though I was heading to the Rose and Crown, I somehow, without thinking or planning it, detoured past Sheila's house. Through the window, I saw the children sitting down to eat, and Sheila was there, talking on the phone. The thought of walking up the path and knocking on the door crossed my mind, but I couldn't bring myself to do it. My stool was empty, and George greeted me with a "Hi Graham," starting to pour my pint as if I had been there just yesterday. I remember telling him. Everyone calls me Re nowadays. Whatever makes no difference to me, George replied as he continued serving me. I drank too much that evening, which became clear the moment I woke up in my bed the next morning. It was my hangover more than anything else that made me decide not to go back to my old ways. Well, that was my intention, but the world is full of good intentions, isn't it? For the next 2 evenings, I spent time in the garage. I had this idea of turning it into a workshop. I planned to get myself a hobby like woodworking or something similar so I'd have little projects to work on in the evenings and on weekends. On the 3rd night, a neighbor invited me over for dinner. To be honest, he was tinkering with his wife's car when I got home, and out of desperation for something to do, I went over to offer him a hand. In gratitude, his wife asked me to stay for a meal. I can't say I understood what was happening for the next week or so, but several neighbors would ask me to join them for dinner in the evenings. Looking back now, I can see that it was all planned. Just by chance, the husband or wife would be out in the street when I got home from work, and they would start chatting. Before I knew it, I'd be sitting down to eat with them. Often, the subject of Sheila and the children would come up, but I could only tell them I hadn't seen them since they moved out. This usually brought strange expressions to the wives' faces and awkward silences from the husbands. It must have been the 2nd or 3rd weekend after Sheila had gone home when I encountered her and the kids at the supermarket. To be honest, it wasn't me who ran into them, it was the kids who ran into me, and everyone in that store knew about it. Before I realized what was happening, one was sitting in my shopping cart, and the other 2 were clinging to my arms. Thankfully, the kids were very loud since Sheila and I didn't seem to know what to say to each other. After we finished our shopping, I took them to McDonald's for ice cream. While the kids were playing, Sheila told me about the minor issues she was having with the house, nothing serious, just the usual things you would expect. Something prompted me to invite them all over to my place for dinner that night. For a moment, I thought Sheila hesitated, but the kids made the decision for her. To be fair, Sheila ended up cooking the meal, maybe that's why she hesitated. Sheila had experienced my cooking before. That afternoon was enjoyable with the children over, even though they spent most of their time playing with the neighbors' kids. I assisted, or possibly hindered, she never clarified which, Sheila in the kitchen, and we got along just as well as when she stayed with me. That is, until she asked me to call the children in and get them cleaned up. Unfortunately, we both tried to cross the kitchen simultaneously and ended up colliding near the back door. Sheila lost her balance, and I grabbed her to prevent her from falling. For a brief moment, I was holding her in my arms, and then we both kept apologizing to each other. Embarrassed, we disentangled ourselves and retreated into our shells. We spent dinner that evening listening to the excited children talk about their day with their friends. After cleaning up, I drove the family home. There was discussion about them coming over again and me going to have a meal with them, but no specific date was set. I left my car parked at the Rose and Crowns parking lot that night because I was too drunk to drive it home. On Sunday, after sleeping off the alcohol, I returned to the pub to retrieve it, but it stayed there for another night. The truth is, I just didn't want to go back to that empty house until I had to, or I was too drunk to notice the silence. On Monday morning, instead of going to work, I went to the real estate agent to put my house on the market. I had no idea where I was going to live, but I knew I couldn't stay in that empty house any longer. Losing one family there was bad enough, but losing a second was too much for me. I moved out, leaving the house furnished until it was sold, as the agent said it would be easier to sell that way. I moved into a small residential hotel near my workplace. It was quite pleasant, but I didn't make many friends among the other residents. I had been slowly reverting to the miserable old person I had been a year before. I received invitations in the mail to attend Sheila's children's Christmas plays and concerts at their school. I accompanied Sheila to all of them, although the tight seating made it uncomfortable, practically forcing physical contact between us. I sensed Sheila's discomfort with this as she seemed to tense up whenever we touched. The topic of dining at their house came up again, but once more, I managed to evade committing to a specific date when the children asked if I would join them on Christmas Day. I could tell they were disappointed when I explained that, unfortunately, I had other plans. I concocted a story about visiting my sister on the South Coast, though I'm not sure Sheila believed it. The children seemed to. I spent a considerable amount of time selecting Christmas presents for Sheila and her children, arranging for a local courier company to deliver them to her house on Christmas Day. It was pricey, but I felt it was worth it for the element of surprise. On the evening before Christmas Eve, I once again found myself drawn to the Rose and Crown. Surprisingly, it wasn't as crowded as it had been the previous year. Perhaps it was a different night of the week. It must have been around 10 o'clock when suddenly a voice interrupted my thoughts. "Feeling any happier this year, Ree?" I turned to see the old man seated on the stool beside me. "Oh, it's you again. Where did you come from?" I asked, taken aback. I hadn't noticed him enter the pub or buy the drink he was holding from George. Then again, I was probably lost in my own thoughts. "I'm always around somewhere, Ree. You just don't see me," he replied. It sounded like the old man had already had too much to drink. "What are you having?" I asked, motioning for George to refill my glass, but the old man declined, waving his hand to indicate he didn't want another drink at the moment. George brought over my fresh pint and then lingered with a peculiar expression on his face. "This one's on the house, Ree, and I think you should make it your last for tonight," he said, refusing my money. I didn't pay much attention to George's words as I had a few questions for the old man. "Where were you that night of the fire?" I inquired. "When I emerged from that house, you were nowhere to be found." "I was occupied, Ree." The old man paused for a moment as if considering his words. "Before I retired, I was a pediatrician. I was in the ambulance assisting the paramedics with the children. By the time I came out, you had already left." "But what about my phone? How did you return it to me?" "I gave it to a policeman." "You didn't look well when you emerged from that house. I assume he must have returned it to you or placed it in your pocket." I had to confess that might have been how I retrieved the phone. I couldn't quite recall the exact sequence of events or conversations when the police officer approached and instructed everyone to move away from the fire. "You visited the hospital the following day," I remarked, still trying to comprehend the actions of this elderly man. "Indeed, I did. I wanted to check on the children's recovery. It was quite fortunate timing the night of the fire. Just a few minutes later, it could have been a disaster." "But how did you know Sheila had my phone number or even my name?" "From your cell phone, Ree. Your name and number are labeled on the back." That was true. I had a company cell phone, and they all had labels indicating ownership when scattered around the office. As I sipped my pint, I continued to probe the old man with questions to which he provided reasonable answers. Yet there was something about him that didn't quite add up in my mind. "So, Ree, are you going to spend Christmas with Sheila and the kids?" he suddenly inquired. "No, I didn't think it was a good idea," I responded. "Why not?" he demanded, sounding shocked. "Because why? Spit it out. Those kids will miss you." "Because of Sheila." I glanced around to check if anyone was nearby. George was busy with another customer at the far end of the bar, but no one else was within earshot. "I think I've fallen for her." "And that's a good reason to skip spending Christmas with her?" "I would have thought that was a damn good reason to spend time with her and her family." "But she doesn't feel the same way about me." What makes you think that? Well, I did something really stupid. Damn, I don't know why I'm telling you this. Maybe you need to, so spill it, the old man urged. Last New Year's Eve, she had only been at my place for a couple of days, and I'm ashamed to say I crossed a line. I think I upset her. How exactly did you cross the line? Well, I kissed her and oh God, I touched her inappropriately. Can we change the subject? No, I don't think we can. So, what made you stop? Nothing. I had had too much to drink. Why does that not surprise me? The older man interjected. Anyway, I suddenly realized what I was doing and stopped myself. So, Sheila didn't stop you. You stopped yourself? Yes. If she didn't stop you, why did you stop? Maybe she wanted you to continue. She might have let me because I saved her and her family's life. I don't want a woman to sleep with me out of gratitude. Did you discuss this with Sheila? Don't be ridiculous. It would have been too embarrassing. She was embarrassed enough just being in the house with me after that. Oh, so embarrassed that she didn't leave with her children? Well, she didn't have anywhere to go. Nonsense. The insurance company paid you to accommodate her and the children, didn't they? Sheila could have left whenever she wanted. Why did she choose to remain, then? Consider this, could it be that she had developed feelings for her guardian angel? The elderly man suggested, then added quietly, it's a pity that's never happened to me. She never mentioned anything to me. And did you express your feelings to her? Regularly? Of course not. If I had told Sheila how I felt and she didn't reciprocate, it would have been too awkward for her to stay at my house. Do you not think there's a chance Sheila was thinking the same thing, Ray? But explain why you've declined her dinner invitations. How do you know I have? And for that matter, how do you know she's invited me? Let's just say it's apparent to me, shall we? But you're mistaken. That woman has feelings for you. Suddenly, the pub doors burst open, flooding the room with a boisterous crowd. Conversation became impossible, and for a few minutes, I shifted my focus away from the old man. When things calmed down, I realized he was no longer seated beside me. George, where did that elderly man disappear to? I inquired as he approached to refill my glass. Which elderly man? The elderly fellow I was conversing with. Goodness, Ray, you've had more than enough to drink tonight. You've been sitting there chatting to yourself all evening. It's time for you to head home, I reckon. George pulled the pint away from me once more and emptied it into the sink. Do you need me to call a taxi for you, Ray? He offered. George, I think you should consider cutting back on the alcohol yourself, I retorted as I stepped off my stool. Once George decided I'd had my fill, I knew I wouldn't get any more from him that night. On Christmas Eve, I woke up without a hangover. It was pleasant, but not as surprising as it might have been if Sheila hadn't been living with me for a year. Before she and the children moved in, hangovers were routine for me. Like many people, I had the day off work and spent it browsing the shops. I had already bought the children's and Sheila's gifts, which would be delivered by couriers in the morning, but I found a couple of other items I thought they would appreciate. After wrapping them up, I took them to the courier's office to be added to the delivery. Then I returned to the hotel with a couple of bottles of alcohol, which I believed would keep me pleasantly intoxicated until after Boxing Day. Back in those days, pubs didn't stay open for long on Christmas Day. As I exited the dining room in the hotel that evening, I was approached by another guest known to everyone as the Major. Mr. Stark, my dear fellow, do you happen to play bridge? He inquired. Well, I've dabbled in it, but I'm not particularly skilled, I responded reflexively, caught off guard by his question. Marvelous. You're just the person we need. We're not too serious about it ourselves. However, Mrs. Brandt has visitors tonight. Would you mind filling in as a fourth until our guests depart? I found myself unable to refuse the old chap. It's baffling how effortlessly officer types can persuade you to do things. Before I knew it, I was seated with 3 elderly gentlemen playing bridge instead of heading to the Rose and Crown. At least it's only until Mrs. Brandt's guests leave, I reasoned to myself. Fat chance, she never appeared, and we were still playing at midnight. As the game concluded and they retired to bed, the Major and the others thanked me for joining. By then, they were well aware of my incompetence at bridge, yet they remained silent. Fortunately, no money was at stake, otherwise, I'd have been destitute. After they left, I spent some time in the lounge idly watching TV. It wasn't until I climbed into bed that I realized I had only had a couple of sherries with the Major and his friends that night. I had wanted a beer or two, but it didn't feel appropriate to drink beer while playing bridge. I woke up early on Christmas morning for reasons unknown, perhaps because I hadn't drunk anything the night before. As I descended the stairs to breakfast, I was surprised to find something waiting for me at the reception. "Mr. Stark, there are some packages here for you," the receptionist exclaimed as I approached. I did a double take as she gestured towards the small pile of brightly wrapped gifts. They were my presents for Sheila and the kids. What were they doing at the hotel? Assuming the delivery had been botched, I called the couriers to demand they send the parcels to the correct address. All I received was a recorded Christmas greeting and a message that the office wouldn't reopen until the day after Boxing Day. "The elderly gentleman who delivered them appeared a bit forgetful to me," remarked the young receptionist, graciously disregarding the curses I muttered as I hung up the phone. "Don't tell me, a short, somewhat stout fellow with white hair and a beard," I said, observing her. "Why yes, that sounds like him." "Do you know him?" she inquired, smiling. "Unfortunately, I believe I do. Could you arrange for a taxi to transport these for me?" "Of course, Mr. Stark. Go ahead and have your breakfast, and I'll notify you once the taxi arrives so you can settle the fare." However, the girl hadn't contacted me by the time I emerged from the dining area after a relaxed breakfast. "I'm sorry, Mr. Stark. It's odd, but I've attempted to contact every taxi company we usually use, and none of them have a vehicle available. It may not seem logical to you, but concerning that elderly gentleman, it's becoming clear to me, young lady. Would you mind assisting me in taking these to my car?" As I arrived at Sheila's house and parked, the front door swung open, and her 3 children dashed out eagerly to welcome me. I won't delve into the details of the day, but I will mention that despite my prior declaration of not attending, it seemed my arrival had been expected. I noticed that the dining room table had already been set for 5. It wasn't until after the children had gone to bed that I questioned Sheila. "You were expecting me?" "Of course. But I explicitly said I wouldn't be coming." "Yes, you did, but I bumped into your friend yesterday, and he assured me you'd be here today." "Let me guess, the stout fellow?" "Yes, the one who visited you in the hospital last year." "Did he happen to mention anything else?" "Just that I should lock the door after you arrived and get hold of your car keys." I glanced at the coffee table where I'd left my keys. They were nowhere to be seen. "Looking for these?" Sheila teased, holding out my car keys. "Yes. Could I have them back, please?" "Of course, but you'll have to come and get them," she replied mischievously, pulling her dress away from her chest and dropping the keys down her cleavage. Then she sat back, grinning at me. "What's my next move?" I pondered aloud. "Come and get them," Sheila exclaimed, springing up and hurrying towards the lounge door. "You know where the bedroom is, don't you?" Less than a month later, Sheila and I were married. Maybe you saw it coming before I did. They say blindness affects those who refuse to see. For the past 13 years, we've been happily living together in this house. Here I am on Christmas Eve, with my dear wife beside me, gazing at an old charred photograph hanging above the fireplace. It was after our wedding when some fire-damaged photo albums from Sheila's home were finally returned to her. They had endured both water and fire damage. The insurance company had sent them to specialists to salvage what they could. "Who's this in the picture, Sheila?" I asked as we flipped through the albums for the first time. "That's my grandfather, my dad's father. I love that photo. Doesn't he remind you of Santa Claus? He looks just like the old man, you know, the one you call my buddy." "No, I don't think so. He was much taller than my grandfather. It's strange though, I remember him looking serious when I was young, but he looks so happy here. I guess memory can be deceiving. Life moves on.